Okay, Econ students, Mod 75, Externalities and Public Policy. Now, buckle your seats. This is going to be a little longer. We're going to go through some very specific examples so you get the concepts. You can read here the learning objectives. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to do in terms of economic concepts. First off, as you know, pollution is a form of negative externality. It can be lessened with environmental standards, emission taxes, and or tradable emissions permits. All public policies, as opposed to the Coase theorem, which allowed for a private solution. Okay, and the second concept is when a consumption of a good generates external benefits to third parties, it is said to provide a positive externality. And the market will underproduce a good with a positive externality because, listen to this, marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal private benefit. Again, the margin will underproduce a good with a positive externality because the marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal private benefit. Okay, this outcome creates deadweight loss that can be eliminated with a Pigovian subsidy, not a tax, a subsidy, equal to the marginal external benefit. Opposite side of the coin, the market will overproduce a good with a negative externality because the marginal social cost is greater than the marginal private cost. And we'll learn about private and social costs in a second. But remember, this outcome then can create a deadweight loss that could be eliminated with a Pigovian tax equal to the marginal external cost. Okay, so Pigovian subsidy is associated with underproducing because of a positive externality, and a Pigovian tax is associated with overproducing good with a negative externality. Okay, so let's get into this a little bit. Those are the three policies we just talked about. I'm going to do a little example when we're going to impose a tax on every ton of pollution eliminated. So let's grab this graph up here, and you can take a look at it. So remember that the benefit of the next ton of pollution, or the ton removed, next ton removed, so to speak, right? That's what the benefit is. The next ton removed is represented by that MSB curve here. Okay, remember that pollution removal measures are called pollution abatement. So I'm going to use pollution abatement a lot. So just remember that. And if $1 million is required to reduce pollution by 1 ton, you all know that $1 million is now not being used in the next best alternative. Thus, or therefore, if 1 ton of pollution is allowed to exist, society will receive 1 million of marginal benefit. Okay, so as long as the tax here is above the MSB curve, the $500 tax here, right? As long as this tax is above the MSB curve, it will be cheaper for the firm to spend money on abatement measures than it would be to pay the tax. Okay, let's look at the graph again. If the tax is set at 500, look at this. Firms will spend money on abatement measures right from Q market all the way back to Q optimal. So if the tax is set at a point where MSB equals MSC, pollution will be reduced to the socially optimal amount. We'll demonstrate this in a second, right? But by putting a price, i.e. the tax, on each ton polluted, the government gives the firms a financial incentive to reduce pollution, which is key. We know this. We act on incentives, including firms. So why is this better than a strict environmental standard? Why should we impose some form of tax, right? Why should we do that as opposed to this environmental standard, which we've had for a while, which don't necessarily work that well? We'll go through this, right? Both policies, though, can reduce pollution to Q optimal, but here, the tax is going to do it more efficiently than the standard. Okay, so here, let me switch to another solution. And I'm going to expand on the example in the textbook a little bit, but polluting firms are all going to have different mechanisms to reducing their pollution, right? Remember, they all are different. So these differences are seen in the differences in the costs of implementing pollution abatement, okay? Which means that some older firms will need to spend more money to reduce their pollution, and a newer firm will actually need to spend less. So let's look again. I'm going to take it a little bit from your book, but I'm going to name it a couple different things. Here we have HCC and LCC. So if there are 2 polluting firms in this town, and each emits crazy gunk into the environment, the high-cost carbon guy is a factory built 50 years ago and hasn't adopted very much green technology over the years. Okay, so that's HCC. And low-cost chemical was built recently with state-of-the-art pollution control. So it's fairly recent. fairly affordable controls. Each firm is needed, though, to reduce pollution by 1 more ton. If they do, if each firm is required to do that, it's clearly going to cost LCC much less to install more pollution abatement than it would cost HCC. Okay, and we can see the difference in these curves right here, right? So look, if there were no pollution regulations, let's start off there. If there were no pollution regulations at all, where would each firm produce? Hopefully you've all said 600 tons. Remember, it's unregulated. They're going to produce where MSB equals 0. Guess what? We're going to have 1,200 tons of pollution emitted into the environment. 1,200 tons of gunk. Well, let's talk about the environmental standard, and then we'll relate that to sort of this tax we just had, right? So on the environmental standard, what would happen? Let's say each firm is going to be required to cut pollution in half. All right, so that's the standard. So this is going to remove half of the pollution from the environment. So we're going to go down to 600 total tons, right? But look at it, it's twice as costly for HCC to reach that standard as it is for LCC. Okay, look at the graph. Look at MSB. HCC is 300 for the 300th ton, but what is the marginal social benefit for LCC? 150 for the 300th ton. And by the way, you know, some of you guys love your little math, so look at the total abatement cost for HCC. It's the area in the triangle, right? 1/2 base times height. Look at 1/2 times 300 times 300 tons, okay, is 45 grand, right? So you got 45 grand for the total abatement cost for HCC. What is it for LCC? 1/2, 150 times 300. Okay, because look at there's different costs there. So the area, so that's only 22,500. So the total cost to reach a standard of 600 tons, and you want to remember this one, is 67,500. True? All right, so that's where we are with this. What about an emissions tax? How would that work? Okay, so if the government is considering imposing a tax on each ton of pollution that is emitted and sets the tax such that the total of 600 tons will be emitted or permitted, so to speak, and if the tax is set, for instance, at say $200 per ton, LCD will reduce pollution. So let's hopefully I have that slide next. There it is. So if the tax is set at $200, right? If that's the tax, right? This is going to get us there. All right, per ton, 200 per ton. LCC is going to reduce pollution even more. They're going to reduce it to 200 tons, okay, under that standard, while HC reduce it by a little less to 400 because they have a cost structure, right? But look, let's look at what this graph is telling us. We see that the total pollution abatement in the triangles under the respective MSB curves. Let's look at the curves, right? Now it's going to be the total cost. You should be able to figure this out. 1/2 for HCC is 1/2 base time height. HCC is 1/2 200 times 200, which is 20K, right? So you got HCC abatement costs are going to be $20,000, right? LCC is going to be what? It's going to be $40,000. So guess what? We're at a difference of 7,500 because this is 60,000, right? Our area of the curve for LCC is 1/2 200 times 400, so we have $60,000 of cost. So HCC and LCC, they pay their money, but as far as efficiencies are concerned, the total cost to reach 600 tons is 60 grand. So the tax policy achieves the same goal, but does it at a lower cost to what? To society. So when each plant values a unit of pollution equally, there is no way to rearrange sort of pollution reduction among the various plants that achieves the optimal quantity of pollution at a lower total cost. So again, when each plant values a unit of pollution equally, there is no way to rearrange pollution reduction among the various plants that achieves the optimal quantity of pollution at a lower total cost. Really important stuff. Okay, so let's switch gears to tradable emissions permits. Right, going back to the outcome we saw with the environmental standard, let's go back to that, right? Each firm was required to emit only 300 tons of pollution, right, to have the total. So that was 600 total. That's the environmental standard, right? Well, now suppose that HCC and LCC meet for pancakes, right? They go meet and they go to IHOP. They get together and the head of HCC says, the standards are killing me. It cost me $300 to reduce that last ton of pollution, and only cost you $150 to reduce the last ton of pollution. How about if I pollute one more ton and you pollute one less ton? So they start this almost like this private solution, right? This Cosium-based solution. Oh, the president of LCC says, sure, but reducing my pollution by 1 more ton will cost me a little more than 150. So I'll need at least that much payola sort of to agree to this deal. And the other president goes, well, no problem. So polluting 1 more ton will save me a little less than 300, excuse me. So we can arrange and agree on a price between 350. That will make us both happy. So again, they're having this conversation. They're trying to negotiate how they can sort of trade off each other to get the same result but lower costs, right? So the two firms are trading pollution. That's what they want to do. They're sort of trading these rights to pollution. Okay, so as long as there's an agree on a price between 300 and 150, sort of their limits, they're both going to be happy, and hopefully they'll generate the kind of pollution they need, but we will get to 600 total, 300 each, or actually whatever it may be, but it's going to be 600 total. That's the goal, right? Okay, so if the two firms were trading pollution, the high-cost firm saved money by polluting more, relatively speaking, but had to pay the low-cost firm to produce less. That's what we're talking about. So the high-cost firm is going to pay the low-cost firm to pollute less. The same total amount, though, has to be emitted. So this is a system of tradable pollution permits. Works like this. The government will issue or auction off like 600 permits. All right, just follow along here. 600 permits. All right, and I'll write this on the side. So if they have 600 permits, this is what they're going to auction off, right? Each allowing the holder to emit 1 ton of pollution. All right, so this is obviously that if you have 600, and this is all worth sort of 1 ton each. Okay, so that's sort of this is all they're going to auction off. So guess what? We have our goal. We're going to go from 1,200 for sure today. We're going to go to 600, so that's good. So it's going to remove 600 tons of pollution from the environment. Okay, now here's the key. If a firm finds that they need to pollute more, right, they're going to buy permits. So if they really had, look, man, we're HCC, we're going to have to buy some permits from a firm that found they could produce less. So they have this ability to trade. So like, look, HCC knows that it's cheaper to buy a permit. It's cheaper to buy a permit than to invest in the tech it's going to take to lower their pollution emissions. If that's the case, in other words, abatement equipment, and their profits are going to get hurt. Okay, the firm, they're going to want to buy some permits from LCC. Well, it makes sense because LCC could sell permits knowing it's cheaper to install abatement equipment, so it sells excess permits and profits from the transaction. So that makes sense. So when there are no more mutually benefit transactions to be made, we're at equilibrium price. Whatever that is set for the permits, it's going to be. And there's no real good example because whatever it ends up being, right? So that's pretty cool. That's how we get sort of this idea of tradable emissions permits. By the way, it's being kicked around in Congress as we speak. All right, so let's just talk about, in the next section, production, consumption, externalities. Okay, so look, the production and consumption of most goods does create some form of pollution or external costs upon society. It's just a fact if you really go think about it. So even the simple act of using electricity to operate, this iPad here and the laptop I'm using is definitely contributing to burning coal somewhere or nuclear fuel somewhere, right? So not all production and consumption creates a negative externality, but sometimes a positive externality exists. For instance, if one person spends money to beautify her or his house and yard, the neighborhood's going to benefit. Certainly the neighbors around that house will benefit, but the neighborhood generally benefits. The property is also pleasant for those who drive or walk past it, so you're going to have some external benefit. So we're going to see that when external benefits exist from the production and consumption of a good, that market will underproduce that good, which is one of the concepts we talked about. In other words, society would benefit from more, but the market produces less. Okay? We will look also at the issue of external costs, like pollution. Again, when there is a good is produced and consumed. So what we'll see then is the market will overproduce such goods and society would benefit from less, but the market produces more. Okay, society will benefit from less of that production, but in fact the market's going to produce more. So let's just talk here about private versus social benefit, then we'll talk about private versus social cost. Okay, so let's talk about private versus social benefits. When the production and consumption of a good provides benefits to third parties, that good is said to provide a positive externality to society. For instance, if I consume a chocolate bar, right, this provides me with, right, my own little private benefit, but my friends, neighbors, or fellow citizens of the world receive no benefit at all from my action. Would you all agree to that, right? Okay, but if I consume, I think your book talks about, so we'll talk about like a flu shot or a chickenpox vaccination, right? My friends, neighbors, and fellow citizens of the world are going to receive definite some benefit of that because these two viruses may be sort of contained for them. They may not get them. All right, so if Spa spends lots of money on improving the value of his house, okay, he's going to receive some private benefit. But look, the improvement of the house, as I said, is going to have some spillover benefit. It's one of the sort of phrases you got to know, spillover benefits to his neighbors by raising the value of everybody's home. So in the case of home improvements, there's a difference between private benefits that Spa receives and the external benefits that his neighbors receive. Would you agree to that? Okay, economists like to sum all the benefits up, both private and external, to get the total benefits received by society. So, total social benefit equals total private benefit. Total social benefit equals total private benefit. Okay, total private benefit. Okay, total private benefit. Okay, plus total external benefit equals total social benefit. All right, and so if you look at on an incremental basis, the next unit of, let's talk about home improvement or the fuel shot, whatever it is, the next unit of improvement provides marginal social, marginal private, and marginal external benefits. So the marginal social benefit then, okay, equals marginal private benefits, okay, plus marginal external benefits. Really important. So MSB equals MPB plus MEB. Just got to think about that. It makes a lot of sense. So we can safely say then if marginal external benefit is greater than 0, okay, Spa's neighbors are going to see an increase in their property values when Spa consumes more home improvement goods. Doesn't that just make sense? Okay. So early on we learned that marginal benefit declines as more of a good is consumed. The same is going to be true here though. Okay, that first unit of home improvement provides the greatest marginal benefit. But this marginal benefit will decline. There's diminishing returns. So there's a downward sloping marginal benefit curve. So let's look at what that looks like. Okay. All right. In order to consume, okay, so the downward curve, right? So it's a demand curve for the good. That's basically what it is. So in order to consume more units as the marginal benefits fall, the price must also fall. Let me say it again. In order to consume more units as the marginal benefit falls, the price must also fall. Okay, so in the graph, you see that marginal private benefit declines. Okay, this represents the private benefits that people like Spa receive with more consumption of home improvements and the private market demand curve for the good. So Spa's neighbors also benefit when we add the positive amount of MEB, or marginal external benefit, to the marginal private benefit, i.e. the marginal social benefit curve lies then above the marginal private benefit curve. Just makes sense because it's additive. So let's assume that the supply of a good doesn't generate any external benefits or costs. So we show a typical upward sloping market supply curve for home improvements. Okay, that's our assumption for now. Just know that that's our assumption. The supply of the good doesn't generate any external benefit or cost, the supply. So we're going to show a typical just basic supply curve. So let's look at the market outcome now. Follow along. Okay, equilibrium curves, right? So equilibrium is going to occur when the supply curve intersects with MPB, or private demand, and Q market is produced at the price of P market. Okay, makes sense? This is the same outcome we have seen throughout this course so far, right? But the marginal private benefit only reflects the benefit received by the actual consumers of that home improvement good. It does not reflect all of the benefits like those received by Spa's neighbors. When we include the external benefits, the price society would be willing to pay for Q market is higher at PMSB. Okay, so let's look at the socially optimal outcome then. If the external benefits are considered, the socially optimal outcome is where the supply curve intersects the MSB curve at Q optimal. And Q optimal is produced at a price of P optimal, right? This is it right here, right? The socially optimal outcome. At this point, the marginal cost, look at this, the marginal cost of producing home improvements from the supply curve, remember, is equal to the marginal benefit society receives from consuming them. Okay? Socially optimal outcome is where MSB equals MSC. Right? Does that make sense? MSB equals MSC. Okay? So the difference between the market outcome and socially optimal outcome is this. We can see that, look, under market pressures, so we can see that the market underproduces goods, that generates positive externalities. Look at this again. Okay, the market clearly underproduces goods that generate positive externalities. In other words, we don't get enough of a good thing, right? Look is this a big deal? Well, it's inefficient and produces deadweight loss like the price controls of a monopoly, right? And this represents benefits that would be enjoyed by society if the socially optimal, not the market output, was produced. Okay, the difference between market outcome and socially optimum is you're going to have this deadweight loss. So the benefit of benefits that would be enjoyed by society if we were at the socially optimal point is not going to happen. Not the market output was produced, right? So look at the area of the deadweight triangle. This is going to be above the supply curve with the base of Q optimal minus Q market and the height of P MSB minus P market. Okay, you see the deadweight triangle. Okay, so I'll just get the pen out so you have this deadweight loss in here, right? So you have this crazy old dead loss. Well, what policy do we know of could eliminate the deadweight loss? And that's the key. We're talking about government policies. This is where we get into something called the Pigovian subsidy. Okay, we can get into the Pigovian subsidy. So if we could somehow provide a subsidy, remember subsidy is a gift outwards, on each unit of home improvement goods demanded by people like SPA, right? So maybe the government provides a voucher to every consumer that is redeemable for home improvement goods. In other words, a subsidy, right? It's going from the circular flow from the middle of government going out to subsidy. Let's say they provide each consumer a redeemable voucher. This increases each person's private willingness to pay for each unit of the good. If the subsidy was equal to MEB, it would shift the MPB curve upwards so that it would located on the MSB curve, right? Do you see what's going on there? The curve would shift upward. If the subsidy was equal to MEB, right, MEB, it would shift the MPB curve upward so that it was located on the MSB curve. And that's the key. So the subsidy will force this, right? This would increase the output to Q optimal, increase the price suppliers receive to P optimal, but the price, in this case, P consumer, pre-cons, pay would be P optimal minus P subsidy, which is actually lower than the original price P market. It has to be because you're subsidizing it, right? We can see this in this version here of this graph. Okay, so take a look again. If you have this curve that gets shifted, right, MPB that overlies on MSB with this subsidy right here, right? Look what P cons. This is what the price the consumer is going to pay, and clearly that was lower than the original P market, right? Which is this subsidy difference, right? That's the key subsidy. But P optimal, right? What's P optimal, right? This is the original price suppliers would receive. So if suppliers receive this and the consumers pay this, the total subsidy is this delta in here. That kind of makes sense, all right? So that's the Pigovian subsidy. What about private versus social costs when we're going to get into the Pigovian tax? Okay? Okay, so we went through private versus social benefits. Let's talk about private versus social costs. We're going to go from a Pigovian subsidy to a Pigovian tax at the end. Okay, so when firms produce goods, we all know there's production costs, right? So private costs of production are the private side of the cost curve here. So when production of a private good generates external costs, a negative externality, on society it means that there are others, third parties, that are also incurring costs, and those costs must be added to private costs to reflect the total cost of producing the product, right? So in our discussion in previous modules, right, the previous mod, we talked about forms of electricity, and they're going to produce pollution as a byproduct. So in the case of home electricity production, there's a difference between private costs incurred by the producers and external costs that citizens must bear. Okay, again, we're economists, so economists like to add things up in terms of costs, and so the total social cost equals the total private cost plus the total external cost. However, we're doing marginal analysis, so marginal social cost is going to equal marginal private cost plus marginal external cost. Makes a lot of sense. Let's do an example where we go through it, and kind of like just the reverse side of the benefit side. Let's focus on the marginal costs. Okay, so we also learned previously in previous mods, marginal cost rises as more of a good is produced. So as opposed to diminishing returns on benefits, a marginal cost rises more as a good produced. The same is true here, so therefore we have this upward sloping marginal cost curve, which happens to be also the supply curve. Okay, in order to produce more units, marginal cost rises and the price must also rise. Okay, that makes sense. Now, in this graph you see here, we show you that marginal private costs are increasing. This represents the private cost that a power plant must incur with more production of electricity, and is the private market supply curve for that good for the firm. But the environment also incurs costs, right? So when we add the positive amount of marginal external cost to the MPC, the MSC curve has to lie above the MPC curve here, right? It just makes a lot of sense. Again, for this particular case, we're going to assume that the demand for the good doesn't generate any external benefits or costs, so we have a typical downward sloping demand curve. All right? So let's talk about market outcome. Okay, equilibrium is going to occur where the demand curve intersects the MPC, or private supply, and Q market is produced at the price of M market. Okay, again, equilibrium is going to occur where the demand curve intersects MPC and Q market is produced at the price P market. This is the same outcome we've seen throughout this course, right? So if you look at, but the MPC, now look at MPC. The MPC only reflects the costs incurred by the producers of electricity. It doesn't reflect this sort of external costs, all the costs borne by the surrounding environment. When we include the external costs, the price society would be willing to pay for Q market is higher at PMSC. So you're just sort of shifting that supply curve to the left or up. Okay, so you can see that that the price society would be willing to pay for Q market is PMSC. Now, what's the socially optimal outcome? If the external costs are considered, which you have to, the socially optimal outcome is where the demand curve intersects the MSB curve and Q optimal is produced at a price of P optimal. Okay, that's where the marginal cost and marginal benefit curves come together. Okay, and so this is where the marginal benefit consuming electricity, right, from the demand curve is equal to the marginal cost society incurs from producing it. Where MSC is which one you want to be. Okay, so again, the socially optimal outcome is where MSB equals MSC. Now, the difference between the market outcome and socially optimal outcome. Okay, so we can see that the market overproduces goods that generate negative externalities. Okay, the market does. In other words, we get too much of a bad thing. They say, oh, okay, well, is this a big deal? Well, it's inefficient and produces a deadweight loss, just like price controls and monopoly. It is just like controlling price controls and monopoly, right? This represents additional costs that would not be incurred by society if the socially optimal, not the market outcome was produced. All right, so you could probably figure out where the deadweight loss is. It's a triangle above the demand curve with the base Q market minus Q optimal. Just draw this for you. You should be able to see it. Okay, but the height is P MSE minus P market, right? So it's sort of like right in here. So you have this little deadweight loss. And again, what's the issue? The issue is, could we have a policy to eliminate the deadweight loss? Okay, we could. Okay, and that's this whole notion of the Pigovian tax. We could provide a tax, right, on each unit of electricity supplied by the power plants. This would increase each firm's private marginal cost of each unit of the good. So, if the tax were equal to MEC, okay, if the tax were equal to MEC, all right, what would happen? Okay, it would shift the MPC upward, right? It would shift the MPC curve upward so that it was located on the MSC curve. This would decrease output to, okay, to what? Q optimal. It would decrease optimal to Q optimal and increase the price consumers pay to P optimal. Okay, but the price P firm receives would be P optimal, right, minus the tax. That makes sense. Pre-optimal minus that, which is actually lower than the original price P market. Okay, this graph describes exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, of course, producers don't appreciate receiving a lower price after the tax is paid on each unit of electricity they produce, but this provides an excellent incentive to develop better ways of producing electricity so that less production is created and fewer dollars are spent. All right? And consumers don't necessarily enjoy paying higher prices for electricity. They've grown accustomed to buying at very low rates. Of course, consumers have been receiving a discount on electricity because the market price didn't reflect all of the costs we incur from generating electricity to begin with. The challenge in politics, though, is getting people to recognize that. So the new higher price reflects all of society's costs and sends consumers a powerful incentive to use electricity. That may or may not work, but again, Congress is actively working on it. It's more going to be towards the subsidy than the tax, however. It just makes political sense. Finally, we're going to deal with something called network externalities. Hopefully this is working. I don't see it working. Let's see. Okay, got it all fixed. So finally, network externalities. A network externality exists when the value to an individual of a good or service depends on how many other people use the same good or service. Okay, so when more people use, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, it becomes more valuable to you. When more people have cell phones with Verizon service, it means your Verizon phone can call more people at lower prices. Okay, so if you buy an electric car, you'll need recharging stations so that you can get a charged battery when yours is low. If there are more people driving more electric cars, there's going to be more recharging stations will emerge. We'll have a bigger ecosystem. It's going to make it more convenient for you and others to sort of fill it up. Okay, this is a network-based externality. Okay, so I hope that helps. That's going to be the end for now of Mod 75. Please do your homework. Thanks. Bye.